Welcome to the second annual Inclusion Fusion Disability Ministry Web Summit presented by Key Ministry and PajamaConference.com. I am Jolene Philo, and I look forward to sharing 6 myths and misconceptions about post-traumatic stress disorder in children with you today. Before we go into what those 6 myths are, we need to define a few terms. So let's talk about the meanings of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma is considered any frightening or scary event that happens to a person, either a child or an adult, and it is so frightening and so disturbing that it causes adrenaline rush. It causes you to have either the flight or fright or fight instinct, and you want to get away from the danger. Now, that's trauma, and after a big trauma, adults and children often have some residual effects. They will have some behavior problems for a while. They'll be worried and jumpy. They may have trouble with sleep. They may have flashbacks. They may have nightmares. That's normal after a trauma. If those continue longer than 3 months after the trauma occurs, then it is identified as post-traumatic stress disorder and is something that needs to be treated. Now, how did I become interested in the subject of post-traumatic stress disorder in children? Well, it started with the birth of our first child, Alan, and if you have the slides available, that you'll see a picture of him on the second slide. That's a picture of him when he was 72 hours old. It was taken 48 hours after he was born, and you notice all the tubes and the needles and everything that are in him. We caught up with him and took that picture about 72 hours after he was born. Our son was only 7 or 8 hours old when he was diagnosed with a disorder called a tracheal esophageal fistula. That was in 1982. Today they call this esophageal atresia. And what it means is that our son's esophagus was not connected to his stomach. To live, he needed immediate surgery. So he was life-flighted 750 miles away from us, and they did surgery before he was 24 hours old. It took us a few days to catch up with him and snap that first picture. Now, our son went through the initial surgery and recovery very well, but when he was 2 months old, he had complications that led to another surgery. Eventually, by the time he was 5 years old, he had had a total of 7 surgeries and hundreds of hospital procedures. He also had another surgery at age 15. When we first saw our son after his surgery, we were really worried because we were told that he was not having any pain medication after that initial surgery, and that newborns didn't need pain medication for their recovery because newborns don't feel pain like adults and other children do. Now, we questioned this because every time our son was lifted into our arms and we were instructed to hold him, we could see pain lines etched on his face. We asked over and over, and we were told over and over by a variety of doctors and nurses and other medical specialists in 1982 that our baby did not feel pain and that he would not remember this when he got older. We kept asking if there were going to be any after effects of this trauma, and we were told repeatedly, no, no, no. We believed them because our son did start to grow into a happy little infant, even though he had these surgeries in between, a preschooler, a toddler, went into elementary school and did well in school, seemed to be well adjusted, and was a happy kid. But when he hit adolescence, we began to see some disturbing behaviors in him. He became somewhat self-destructive and very impulsive and very secretive. Now, to the outside world, he appeared to be highly successful, and he was. He was the jazz band drummer. He had leads in many of the plays. He was in National Honor Society. He was on the academic team. He was very involved in school events. But at home and in secret, we saw these disturbing, impulsive behaviors. And after his junior year in high school, he ran away from home for the first time. That was in the year 2000. This pattern of running continued intermittently until 2003, when he entered a very sheltered religious community And when he was there, he lived there for almost 6 years. At first, while he was there, we saw him become more peaceful. We saw him become more disciplined and less impulsive. But in the 2007 and 2008, that urge to run surfaced again, and he could not overcome it. Finally, in November of 2008, our son called us and said, "Can you help me deal with this? Can you help me figure out what's at the root of this wanting to run away?" Well, by the grace of God, we were led within a week to a treatment facility in Morgantown, West Virginia, called Intensive Trauma Therapy Incorporated. They were able to diagnose him with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they rearranged their schedules because of our unusual logistics situation so that our son was treated the next week. It's an outpatient clinic, and they do 1 or 2 week intensive treatment 5 days a week. Our son started treatment on a Monday. I was with him, and I would drive him to the clinic every day and pick him up and take him back to the motel every evening. And after the 4th day of treatment, he turned to me and he said, "Mom, for the first time in my life, there are no voices in my head. And for the first time in my life, I am not looking over my shoulder, waiting for someone to take me into surgery." Those words broke my heart. And I decided then that I wanted to learn as much as I could about post-traumatic stress disorder because I didn't want other children to have to live for 26 years before getting treatment for what can be easily and effectively treated for when they are children. Our son has made a full recovery. He did not return to that religious community that he had entered. He went back to the Midwest, got a good job, found the girl he'd left behind many years before. They were married in April of 2011, and they recently had their first child. I want, and I know you want, other parents who have children dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder to have restoration and renewal in their lives like our son experienced. And that's why I want to go over these 6 myths and misconceptions about post-traumatic stress disorder with you. Because once you know the truth about them, you may be able to help parents identify that PTSD is the source of their child's behavior problems, and you may be able to point them to treatment and preventative measures to help them, their family, be restored. So let's take a look at these 6 myths and misconceptions. These are things that I've heard over and over and over as I speak on post-traumatic stress disorder. I've done a great deal of research on the topic. I've interviewed a lot of professionals in the field, both clinicians and researchers. And when I go and share about this, the general public repeats back to me these same 6 myths and misconceptions, and I see them in the media over and over. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's take a look at what those 6 myths are. The first one is that only soldiers get post-traumatic stress disorder. The second myth is that this isn't PTSD we're seeing in kids, it's bad parenting. Myth number 3, and this one is common in the Christian community, is that it's not post-traumatic stress disorder we're seeing in these kids, it's sin. Myth 4, kids don't remember what happened to them when we were babies. We heard this one in 1982, and I still hear it today. The same with myth number 5, newborns don't feel pain. And finally, another myth that I read about a lot in the media is that fetuses can't experience trauma. Those are the 6 myths. Let's take a look at each one of them, one by one. The first misconception, only soldiers get PTSD. Now again, the misconception is only soldiers get PTSD. And I can see why that myth has come about, because the first place where post-traumatic stress disorder was diagnosed was in soldiers, and it happened in the Civil War. Civil War vets were often diagnosed with what was called then soldier's heart. This same condition or behavior was seen in World War I and World War II soldiers. Then it was labeled shell shock. You've probably heard of that. And it was only with Vietnam combat vets that the term post-traumatic stress disorder was given for this set of behaviors that the soldiers were displaying after they returned from war. Again, The misconception is that only soldiers can have PTSD, but that can only be true if war is the only source of trauma, and it certainly is not. There are many other sources of trauma. Accidents can be a source of trauma, natural disasters, physical and sexual abuse, adoption, moving a lot, divorce, the death of someone significant. And in a child's world, all of these things can seem traumatic. And of course, war and other violent behavior can too. So war is not the only source of trauma. And also, soldiers aren't the only people that develop post-traumatic stress disorder and are traumatized during war. So are civilians, both adults and children, who are near the battlefield and see the violence that's going on. So while soldiers are at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder and at greater risk than the general population, they are not the only ones who get post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's move on to myth number 2. It's bad parenting, not post-traumatic stress disorder. Once again, you can see how this myth got started because the behavior of traumatized children often mimics the results of poor parenting. Children who have been traumatized often behave a lot like kids who have not been well parented and not had good boundaries and enough security in their lives. Second, parental neglect and abuse and long-term inconsistency in parenting can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. But this excuse, it's bad parenting, doesn't explain aberrant behavior in children who were raised in loving, structured, safe, well-parented homes. And especially, it doesn't explain why this happens where parents have practiced and modeled authentic Christian lives and Christian love for their children. So how do we determine the difference between bad parenting and post-traumatic stress disorder in children? Well, one thing is that we need to not jump to conclusions. We need to study the family dynamics over a long period of time. And if everything you see shows that this family is doing a good job of parenting their children, then we need to look for extenuating circumstances instead of blaming the parents for the behavior of their children. We need to ask questions about the child's history, if there's ever been any source of trauma in that child's life. And if we see any evidence that there has been trauma of some sort in a child's life, we then, as church special needs ministry people, can share information about post-traumatic stress with families when evidence of that childhood trauma does exist. Because it's only then when parents and the general church community will quit blaming parents for bad parenting, and it's only then that they will seek treatment to restore their child's mental health and the family's equilibrium. So let's move on to the third myth, and that is that it's not post-traumatic stress disorder. It's sin that we're seeing displayed in this child's behavior. Now again, I can see where this myth gets started, and I imagine you can too, because children who respond to a post-traumatic stress disorder trigger when they encounter something that reminds them of the initial traumatic event, and then they respond, they often will exhibit what we define as naughty behaviors. They may display anger or belligerence, disobedience, lying. They may even strike out physically. They may, like my son, run away. Now, in Christian circles, when we see behavior in children that appears to be naughty, we perceive it as sin. And what is the Christian antidote to sin? Bringing sinners to a saving relationship with Jesus Christ so they can then repent of those sins and begin to change their behaviors. They move away from the sins and begin to conform to Christ's own example. But when children and adults with post-traumatic stress disorder become Christians, their behaviors that we perceive as sinful rarely change. And this is because they are not the result of willful sin. Post-traumatic stress disorder behavior is triggered by the original event, as I mentioned before. And so it is buried deep within, and the response is involuntary, and it's an instinctual reaction of an injured mind. Now, just like physical injuries, mental injuries need proper treatment and prayer rather than judgment or an urge for salvation for healing to occur. Now, well-meaning believers would never look at the parents of a child who had just broken the child had just broken their leg, and we would never say to that person, oh, well, you need to bring your child to Christ and then that broken leg will heal. No, we would urge the parents to go seek healing for that child's broken leg, and then as the recovery is in progress and the child becomes whole again physically, then we would start talking to the family and to the child about the importance of having Christ in their lives. And the same needs to be true when we're dealing with a child who has a mental injury. We need to urge parents to seek treatment for that child's mental injury. And when the child is mentally whole again and the behaviors have settled down because the injury is gone, then we can talk to the parents and to the child about the need for salvation. And hopefully, because of the restoration they've had mentally, we can lead them to the spiritual restoration we know they need also. Let's go on to the fourth myth now. Kids don't remember what happened to them when they were babies. Well, how much do you remember about what happened to you before age 3? And when you talk to your own children, if you have them, about the things you remember that happened to your kids before they were 3 years old, how much did they remember? Not much. You have to tell them what happened, and they don't remember it. And that's true of all people. We don't remember much of what happens to us before we're 3 years old, because much of that information, we are nonverbal or pre-verbal at that time, and so we don't store what we remember in words, and we can't access it through words or explain it through words. What we remember from when we were before 3 years old is stored as images, senses, smells, sounds, feelings. Now the children store traumatic pre-verbal memories that way. We store them differently than we do our verbal memories. And a white paper at the National Child Traumatic Stress website says that traumatic events have a profound sensory impact on young children. Their sense of safety may be shattered by frightening visual stimuli, loud noises, violent movements, and other sensations associated with an unpredictable, frightening event. The frightening images tend to recur in the form of nightmares, new fears, and actions or plays that reenact the event. That's how we remember traumatic pre-verbal events. The good news is that children also store their good pre-verbal memories differently. Joy D. Osofsky, the author of clinical work with traumatized children, says, a secure relationship with a caregiver provides the most potent defense against overwhelming stress. Caregivers and family systems that function well are the best predictor of good adjustment over time by children traumatized in their early years. So the good things we can put into a child's life after they've been traumatized can help that child recover from the trauma. Case in point comes from our own child's early years. When Alan was in the neonatal intensive care unit, I was often taking naps in our room because I had just given birth. And my husband Hiram would go to the NICU and spend hours with our son. He would sit beside Alan's isolette and he would reach his hand through the little hole in the isolette, and Alan's little body was covered from head to toe with tubes and wires and patches. But Hiram would reach his hand in and he would rub Alan's cheek over and over, and he would talk to Alan in a soft, gentle, quiet, calm voice, hour after hour. Now when our son became verbal, as he got older, he would say to us as a preschooler, as an elementary child, and even into early adolescence, when he got upset or scared or frightened, he would say to us, Mom, Dad, rub my cheek. He remembered that good pre-verbal memory, and he even was able to access and use it to help deal with the trauma that he was fighting against. So, memories are stored in pre-verbal children as images, sounds, smells, and other sensations that can't be put into words, but kids do remember them. Let's go on to to myth number 5. Newborns don't feel pain. This is one we heard often in 1982. And it began with a study that was done in the early 1900s, a study done of newborns at the Northwestern University and Chicago Lying-In Hospital. Now what this study did was it looked at newborns born in that hospital, and every day for 12 days, starting at birth, they pricked the heel of these newborns with a pin or something and observed the response to the pain. And all of the newborns did not respond at all. By the end of the 12-day period, they were responding as you would expect a normal, healthy baby to. But they drew the conclusion then that newborns don't feel pain like other people. It was much later when Dr. David Chamberlain, a psychologist who pioneered the field of prenatal psychology, later explained these puzzling results. He went back and looked at the records and found that all of the mothers who delivered at that hospital were given anesthetic during labor and childbirth, and that anesthetic most likely entered through the placenta into the child's bloodstream, and so these newborns were anesthetized from pain. No wonder they didn't feel the poke at day 1, but did by day 12. Unfortunately, this myth was passed down through the medical community for the next 80 years and wasn't busted until the early 1980s. During that time, clinical trials proved that potent pain medication given to newborns during surgery reduces stress and complications and improved chances of recovery. Dr. Anand, a neonatal intensive care medical resident in a hospital in Oxford, England, was the man who pioneered this study. He couldn't understand why the newborns who had just had surgery and were brought into neonatal intensive care were in such severe distress. Most of the newborns were in shock after surgery. Their blood sugar levels were wild and fluctuating. All their body systems were out of whack, and many of them had weeks of complications, prolonged recoveries, and there was a high mortality rate among newborns who had surgery, especially those who had open heart surgery. Well, finally, Dr. Anand convinced the powers to be in his hospital to let him go into the operating room when newborns were having surgery and then follow them through recovery and into the neonatal intensive care unit. And that's when he found out that these newborns were not receiving pain medication along with the paralytic drug in their anesthetic. So these babies were going through major surgery without any pain medication. He started a clinical trial in which half the newborns received the same kind of anesthetic as before with no pain medication, and the others received pain medication along with the paralytic drug. And the results were astounding. The babies that had received pain medication recovered much more quickly. They were not in as much distress when they entered the NICU. They had many fewer complications, and the mortality rate went down significantly. The results were so amazing that as soon as they were published, protocol for newborn surgery changed worldwide. In 1986, the American Academy of Pediatrics changed their protocol and required newborn babies, to be given pain medication along with the paralytic drug in their anesthetic before having major surgery or any surgery. And as we all know, to do anything different today would be considered inhumane and barbaric. Thankfully, that myth has been busted within the healthcare community, but you still hear pockets of people saying that newborns don't feel pain. Finally, let's go on then to the 6th myth: fetuses can't experience pain. Well, a 2004 study showed that early prenatal and postnatal experiences, including early trauma, are encoded into the memory of a fetus. Clinical psychologist Paula Thompson, who conducted the study, which was published in the Journal of Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology and Health, concluded that these memories will travel with us into our early days of infancy and beyond. A 2007 study found that increased levels of the stress hormone cortisol in the mother's blood resulted in higher levels in amniotic fluid at 17 weeks of gestation, and the correlation increased as gestation progressed. Now, our bodies pump cortisol into the blood when we're anxious or stressed or traumatized, and this is good in the short term because it helps us run from the trauma or escape. But studies have proven that high cortisol levels over the long term will create stress that causes tiredness, depression, and susceptibility to illnesses, and this does carry through with fetuses after they are born. So fetuses do experience the effects of trauma. Those are the 6 myths and misconceptions, but again, let's talk about why it's so important for us to bust them as members of the special needs ministry community. The reason is because effective treatments for children and preventative measures do exist so that trauma children experience doesn't turn into post-traumatic stress disorder, and so children who have post-traumatic stress disorder can be properly treated. Now, churches are in the business of restoration, so it is our duty as members of the special needs ministry community to promote restoration. We can share truth with affected families. We can encourage parents to find treatment for their children. Doing so is biblical because treating trauma in children shows the children the truth about their experience, their traumatic experience. They're then able to put that experience to rest and move forward with their lives. During our son's treatment, one verse from Scripture came to mind over and over. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, which is from John 8:32. Alan's treatment truly did set him and our family free from the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. My prayer is that by busting these myths and misconceptions, many more children and their families will one day experience the same freedom. I hope that you, as a leader in the special needs ministry at your church, will join me in helping parents find the treatment their children need who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. For those of you who would like more information about post-traumatic stress disorder, I invite you to visit the Intensive Trauma Therapy Clinic's website at www.traumatherapy.us. You can also read more about post-traumatic stress disorder in kids at my website, which is differentdream.com. And if you're interested in reading a little bit more about it, there is one chapter in my book, Different Dream Parenting, that deals exclusively with mental illness in children who have special needs, including post-traumatic stress disorder. And this book is available at the Inclusion Fusion website store, so I encourage you to go there. I'm also working on a new book dealing completely with post-traumatic stress disorder in children, but I'm unsure when that book will be released as of now, so keep watching for details on that. Again, thank you so much for joining me today and for taking part in Inclusion Fusion. I hope you have a great time attending all the other sessions. Thank you.